Hi, my name is Taylor Lopez, and I am doing my author discussion on Zora Neale Hurston. This is for my AFAS 160 class with Brian Carter. I chose Zora Neale Hurston because I know that I have heard her name before and that she is an African American writer, but I didn't know what she's written or what she has done in her lifetime, so I thought it would be interesting to continue research on her. So, yeah, let's get started. Okay, Hurston's early life. Hurston was born on January 7th, 1891, in Notasulga, Alabama. Her birthplace has always been under debate since Hurston herself wrote in her autobiography that she was born in Eatonville, Florida, but according to many other sources, she seemed to change it up quite a bit. People think that she probably had no memories of Notasulga because she moved to Florida when she was just a toddler. Hurston was known to adjust also her age and birth year from time to time as well, so her early life information kind of was a little bit jumbled. But she was the fifth of 8 children, so she definitely was the middle child. And Hurston was the daughter of 2 former slaves, John Hurston and Lucianne Potts Hurston, and her father, John Hurston, was a pastor and a farmer. And him and Zora had a really hard time with each other. They didn't really get along, and it was obvious that he liked her sisters better than he actually liked Zora. And he moved the family to Eatonville, Florida, when Hurston was really young, like I said earlier. And Eatonville was an all-black community and was the first incorporated black community in America. So this really sheltered her from racism in her early childhood life. And um, yeah, and she didn't get exposed to racism until later. And when she was 13, her mother died, and it was very hard on her. Her father quickly remarried another woman who Hurston did not get along with at all. And I actually read somewhere that Hurston nearly killed her in a fist fight, so it couldn't have been a very healthy relationship. And soon after that, Hurston left home and ended up dropping out of high school. And she was just bouncing from job to job. And Hurston moved to New York City at the age of 16, and to support herself and finance her efforts to get an education, Hurston worked a variety of jobs, including a maid for an actress in a touring Gilbert and Civilian group. And so that's why she basically moved to New York, because she kind of followed them for work. And there was a big chunk in her life where she basically bounced around from job to job, just trying to make money and get by. Okay, early life continued. So she ended up finishing her education as an anthropologist and folklorist, and by the time she was 26, she needed to finish high school. She knew she needed to finish high school, so she ended up erasing a full decade from her age and told everyone that she was born in 1901. And this is also she could access free schooling, which in my opinion is pretty genius. So she attended high school as a 26-year-old in 1917 and graduated in 1918. She continued her education into college and went to Howard University from 1921 to 1924. And in 1925, she actually won a scholarship to continue her education at Barnard College, and she studied anthropology under Franz Boas. And Franz Boas was named the father of anthropology and revolutionized the field. She graduated from Barnard College in 1928, and she was the college's only African American student, and which I think is pretty amazing. And there she studied more folklore and things like that rather than anthropology, but her background in anthropology and folklores allows her to become an incredible author in the future. So she moves to Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. This is when Hurston starts her writing career, she became a recognized member of the Harlem Renaissance. And I believe we've touched on the Harlem Renaissance in class a little bit, but it was the period during which Black artists broke with the traditional dialect works and stopped imitating white writers to explore their own Black culture and express pride in their own race. Um, so this is really where Zora found her inspiration, and her stories of her early childhood life in Eatonville kind of came out and became a major force in shaping her writing to come. So now I'm going to talk about some of her major works. The Best Short Stories by Negro Writers was one of her first popular works, and at Barnard College, Zora became friends with Langston Hughes and County Cullen, and they published a bunch of short stories that all focused on the central figures and ideas of the Harlem Renaissance. Much of Hurston's work was criticized by the people around her for not aligning with the new political motivations of the broader literary movement of the Harlem Renaissance. And most writers and people aimed to portray the new Negro, which basically means like someone who is like embracing their culture. And the new Negro was a definition given by the African Americans to themselves. And Hurston was heavily criticized for continuing to write about the stereotypical African American and uneducated and like poverty poor African Americans. Okay, so Their Eyes Were Watching God. Hurston returned to Florida in the early 1930s, where she would begin to work on what would become her most important and most popular contribution to American literature and African American literature. The book was published in 1937, and Their Eyes Were Watching God has come to be a pivotal work in both African American and women's literature. I actually read this novel in high school, and it's about a young African American woman in the racial area of southern Florida during the 20th century. And Zora Neale Hurston tells a story of the protagonist and her three main relationships that she learns and overcomes. And the novel basically explores many themes that we've talked about in this class. Obviously, one of the main themes is racism, but the novel also addresses the value or the devaluing of women in relationships and focuses on power and domination. And Their Eyes Were Watching God was very impactful and one of the most memorable novels of the 20th century. This is Main Works Continued, and Moses, Man of the Mountain was one of her novels, and it was published in 1939, and it was based on the familiar story of Exodus, and this is Hurston's third novel, and it blended the character of Moses portrayed in the Old Testament with the Moses of Black folklore and song. And this combination created a really interesting themes such as power, redemption, and even faith. And it was narrated in a mixture of biblical rhetoric and Black dialect, which we've also talked about that in class. And I know in Dr. Carter's first introduction letter, he talks about what Black writers should do and if they should use standard English or dialect to represent speech of Black Americans. So I thought that was an interesting connection. Seraph on the Sweeney is Zora Neale Hurston's novel, and it was her final published novel, and it was published in 1948. And Hurston explored a totally new territory with this novel. It featured white characters in poor rural Florida, and this was because her publisher rejected 2 novels about black characters. And I thought this was interesting because she is writing about racism and the struggles of African Americans while she continues to face her own problems in her everyday life. She was still having to take orders from a white man of what to write and what characters were allowed to be in her novels. So this just goes to show that she was still struggling with white people and taking a stand for herself. This is my conclusion. Zora Neale Hurston passed on January 28th, 1960, and she died because she had heart disease. And Hurston was alone in the time of her death, and she was in poverty. And it's crazy to me that after all of the work and inspiration she put into the world, she just wasn't returned with the same respect when she died. Zora Neale Hurston's hometown of Eatonville, Florida, celebrates her life in an annual festival. Her life and legacy are celebrated every year at the Nora Zeal Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities. There is a Nora Zeal Hurston Museum of Fine Arts named in her honor, and her house in Fort Pierce has been designated as a National Historic Landmark. She was in fact inducted as a member of the inaugural class of New York Writers Hall of Fame in 2010, and it is sad, but Zora Neale Hurston never really got the credit she deserved before she passed. And although she did not get the credit she deserved when she was alive, she was honored after her death. Her novels and other writings are now getting the recognition they've always deserved. She was an amazing woman and overall contributed so much to African American literature and literature altogether. Thank you for listening. And here are just some of the sources I used throughout my author discussion. Thank you guys for listening.